Welcome to the session on spectrum under pressure. Part of the pressure is that we are, if nothing, flexible. In the program, by the way, I'm Robert Pepper from Cisco. On the program, we had 3 speakers, 2 of whom at the last minute, because of circumstances way beyond their control, have had to cancel. One, Jessica Rosenworcel, who's the FCC commissioner, can't travel because the U.S. government's shut down, which you've been reading about, which is very disappointing for a lot of reasons. But for us, the most disappointing reason is that Jessica can't be here, and she's just terrific. Vanu Bose is okay, but he had a bout with pneumonia, and so his doctor said don't get on airplanes, and so he's recuperating, he's fine, so he's not able to join us, but we do have Ulrich Rehfuess from, it's still NSN, it is. But it's now Nokia Solutions and Networks, right, which is great, so you don't have to change the NSN, and you said to me you don't have to change your website. So this makes it easy, right? It used to be Nokia Siemens Networks, but it's still NSN. And we've been joined by Herman Schepers from GSMA, who also is going to be on one of our sessions breakout this afternoon. And it's actually great that Herman is with us because of some of the issues that we'll talk about that he'll raise that have to do with WRC, spectrum regulation, and some of the preparation questions. So, but because of that, I thought what we would do is, instead of my just moderating, I would very quickly try to set the stage by talking about what I see and what we see as the future demand for spectrum and how we're going to do that. And I have 4 points. The first one, very simply, is that the future is broadband and the future is data over all of the wireless networks. Mobile, in my mind, is a subset of wireless, but one size doesn't fit all. And by the way, many of you have heard me make my joke that people talk about mobile networks, and I don't have the foggiest idea what they're talking about. There's no such thing in my mind. Networks don't move. They're not mobile. I am, right? The network is fixed. And in fact, yesterday, Randall Stevenson made that point better than anybody that I've heard make it. And he said as they build out their LTE 4G network across the United States, they have 65,000 masts, towers, base stations that will be connected by fiber. It's the only way that you'll be able to support all of the data traffic on the wireless networks. And these wireless networks are going to be heterogeneous. It will be licensed macro cell when people are moving and outdoors, and it's going to be small cell, whether it's Wi-Fi, femto, pico, whatever, indoors or even outdoors when people are not moving. And we'll talk about that. But one size doesn't fit all. I'm also going to talk about, we talk about broadband and video and data, yes. But we're also talking about, with the Internet of Everything, Internet of Things and data, it's going to also not just be continuous and broadband, it's going to be bursty and narrowband. But all of this is going to raise questions about where are we going to get the spectrum, what kind of spectrum, which frequencies, and how are they going to work together. One size doesn't fit all. Second, we are facing a data deluge, and some of you may have seen some of the data. This is from our annual Visual Networking Index study. This is the latest one from mobile. It's now about 6 months old. And this is a rolling 5-year forecast we do every year. So we look at last year, so we looked at 2012, and we forecast out to 2017. A year ago, we had real data for 2011 and made a forecast for 2016. We're now in our 7th year, so we actually go back and check. So we actually can go back and say, oh, what did we forecast, right, 5 years ago, and what does it look like in actual numbers? And they're pretty good. We're usually within about 10%, usually on the conservative side. And what that means is that the actuals have exceeded the forecast. But we're pretty close, usually within 10%. Global mobile data traffic, top line, is going to grow 13 times from 2012 to 2017 at this is global data, with a compounded annual growth rate of 66%. By region, by the end of the 2017 period, what you can see is that we're forecasting, this is completely consistent with the opening session this morning, which was great. I love the data. You know, almost half of the traffic is going to come from the Asia-Pacific region, China and India. China and India combined 2.6 billion people, right? But there's some differences across the regions. So when we look at the devices, and by the way, the number of devices being used in each region is very, very different profiles. And what you see here is that we're forecasting by 2017, 50% of the devices in the world will still be GSM phones. We call them non-smartphones. There's some feature phones in there, but it's mostly GSM and some feature phones. Still 50% of the devices. What's interesting is, this is global, 27% will be smartphones. Machine to machine will be 16%. Machine to machine is growing, as you'll see. It's the fastest growing category. It's growing. What we're forecasting is that over the next 5 years, machine to machine devices will grow by 24 times, 24x, over the next 5 years. This is number of devices. But when you take a look at the amount of traffic generated by those devices, smartphones, right, which smartphones, 27% of the devices globally will be 67%, 2/3 of the traffic. GSM phones, half the devices, 1.4% of the traffic. Devices matter. Different devices have different requirements. And if you look at the machine-to-machine, although it was going to, they will be 16.5% of the devices, only 5% of the traffic. But more than traffic on than GSM phones, the 2G phones. And what you can see here, in terms of the growth curves, we're forecasting that next year is the year that the GSM phone globally will peak and then decline. By region, if you looked at North America and Europe, GSM phones are already on a dramatic drop in the adoption curve. 3G is growing, and the 4G LTE, which globally is today only 1% of the connections, will be 10% in 5 years. Different profiles by the different types of devices. The 4G phone, LTE, right, on average, these are averages, by device, you're looking at 23 megabits per second, 3G 12, and GSM 13 kilobits, right? And then you sort of average it out. If you look at the traffic, right, remember the number of devices? What we're forecasting is 4G, which will be 10% of connections, will be almost half of the traffic. In fact, what we're finding is that the average 4G LTE phone device consumes 19 times more data per device than the non-4G blend. Just because we have some delegates from Middle East and especially Africa here, what we see is that non-smartphones even by 2017 in Africa, Middle East Africa, it's still going to be 3/4 of the devices. But it's consistent, it's going to be only 6% of the data, and smartphones will be 70% of the data consumption. Big implications for the investments that will be needed, the spectrum that will be needed to meet that demand in the emerging markets. What's the impact of Internet of Things? So let me go back, right? This is the number of devices. The fastest growing category of devices is machine to machine. And in fact, here in the UK, which is a great example of the developed world, and the US has a similar pattern, the rest of Europe is a similar pattern, Japan, the developed economies globally, and this is what the rest of the world is going to look like. What you see is that the non-smartphones, already down to 37%, will decline to 4%. Smartphones are going to increase in terms of the total number will increase, but as a percentage to 41%. Machine to machine is going to grow from 15% to 40% of the devices over the next 5 years. And when we begin to think about all of the billions of things, and some people say it's going to be trillions, of things that will be connected, not over the next 5, but let's say over the next 10 to 15 years, and I'm going to give 2 very specific use cases. Different types of machine to machine and different types of devices, and what we call it's not just the Internet of Things, it's the Internet of everything, right? Because it's the things generate the data. So you have things, you have data, you then have the analytics that processes the data. And when you process the data, it then becomes actionable data. It changes the process. You can do different things that you couldn't do in the past. And then that has an effect on people. So we talk about people, process, data, and things. And the Internet of Things is at the base of that. It's absolutely crucial, but that's not where it stops. That's actually where it starts. We're forecasting machine-to-machine mobile data traffic will grow, as I said, 24 times. It's a compounded annual growth rate of 89%. And 2 use cases. This is a case which is machine-to-machine. Right? We know that in transportation, cars are sending out data, and usually people talk about, it tells you, do you need to take it in for servicing? This is different. This exists today. There's a auto manufacturer, that is collecting terabytes of data in real time from its cars, millions of cars around the world. And they're getting data back from the cars that are being fed into the manufacturing process on the floor. They can look at how are brakes wearing, what's the transmission, the workings in the engine, and if there are any anomalies, the engineers then can take that and in real time do a redesign on the manufacturing floor in the factory, so that the next cars coming off the lines will make adjustments. That's really powerful. Another use case, this one I love, because one of the questions with Internet of Things, these little devices, is how do you power them? This is a pill that this is, by the way, people to machine to people. This is a pill that's already been approved by the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. Right? You swallow so one of the problems, especially with older people, right? They forget to take their pills. So let's say you have a person who has diabetes. They have to take their medication, and they don't. They'll end up in the hospital. Right? They're not well. Very costly. It's very disruptive. It's traumatic, etc. So what this company called Proteus has done is there is a chip the size of a grain of sand. When you swallow it, the digestive fluids interact chemically and create energy. It then communicates to a patch that you wear that communicates to your smartphone that tells the doctor or the nurse, the physician's assistant, they took the pill. If they don't hear from the pill, right, they can call the patient and say, did you take your pill? You know, huge, huge savings, right? In terms of money savings, healthcare, saving lives, trauma, transportation, I mean, everything. It's a way to improve healthcare delivery. Very simple idea, right? So this is a people to machine to people. So, question, what are the challenges, the spectrum challenges that come from the Internet of Things, Internet of Everything? First, it's going to be, the Internet of Things is primarily wireless. There will be some Ethernet connected in the factory floor. But for the most part, we're going to be connecting billions, 20 billion, 50 billion, a trillion. All of these connected devices are going to be connected wirelessly. We will need spectrum. But they all have different characteristics and needs. Right? Some, is it narrowband or broadband? Yes, both. Some will be little bits of data. Right? The pill talks. Right? That is intermittent. It's once, right? And it chirps. It wakes up and it goes, hey, I'm here. On the other hand, another example of an Internet of Things are the traffic cameras that are on the roads that monitor traffic. They're continuous, they're video, and they require a lot more bandwidth. And it's going to be everything in between. So it'll be narrowband and broadband. It's going to be continuous and bursty, chirping. It's going to be short distance from the pill to the patch to the smartphone. It's also going to be longer distance in the agricultural fields, temperature, moisture, and so on. We're going to need scale. The scale is needed to bring the costs down so that we're getting the manufacturing scale on billions of things. That means we will need standards that cut across industry verticals, right? So each industry doesn't have its own. Second, we're going to need harmonized bands or some agreements on the types of spectrum we're going to use. Scale matters, especially when we're talking about things that essentially are going to be used once. The costs have to be low. So, last point. The future for spectrum is both coverage and capacity. What do I mean? Right? We're going to need to be able to have spectrum and radio cover everybody on the planet so that everybody on the planet has access to all of these things. But we also will need, in some places, huge capacity, the data. By the way, the data, you heard it on this morning's panel. You heard it yesterday with Randall Stevenson. Video, video, video. The high consumption applications are video. So we are going to need more spectrum for capacity, and most of that, by the way, will be offloaded when you're at home, when you're not moving, when you're in the office, when you're in central business districts. It's primarily going to be going to small cell Wi-Fi when you're in the cars, when you're outdoors, when you're moving, when you're in rural. It is going to be macro cell licensed 4G. So it's macro cell and small cell, and by the way, they're all going to have to be connected back by fiber. Therefore, we will need more licensed and more licensed exempt spectrum. We're, for example, looking at the 5 gigahertz bands with 802.11 AC for some of the very high capacity. The original Wi-Fi was 20 megahertz channel. Then we went to 40. AC is 80 or 160 megahertz wide channels. The only place you're going to find that amount of spectrum contiguous is way up around the 5 gig. Thank you. And so what I will now do is turn it over to everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Robert, for that very kind introduction and, very useful insight. So I can seamlessly connect to that with my first slide. So we've talked a lot about the 1,000-fold challenge of capacity that we see. So if you consider traffic growth rates like a factor of 2 over 10 years, that leads to such a factor. And, well, this is to indicate the size of the problem we are facing, so that does not necessarily relate to a very specific date now, but it is an enormous challenge. And we've broken that down typically into 3 factors of 10. So one, making the technology more efficient. Then certainly we will need to go into many more cell sites, not necessarily macro cell sites, but very much what Bob also alluded to is this heterogeneous network type, including small cells and fitting them seamlessly into those macro networks. But certainly spectrum is here in the central role, and we definitely need more spectrum to carry these amounts of traffic. So what can we do spectrum-wise? So typically for mobile applications, let's say there is a natural upper bound. If we look into mobility, maybe around the 6 gigahertz, because propagation conditions then get too close to optical, so we need very much line of sight beyond that. That limits it in outdoors very much, but even indoors may become difficult. And then there is a lower limit, maybe 450 megahertz by the size of the antennas. As wavelengths get longer and longer, antennas get bigger and bigger. So within that range, we look at the suitable bands, and you're all aware, I guess, of World Radio Conference 12, World Radio Conference 15, now in World Radio Conference 15 with an agenda item to look into new bands globally for mobile, and in particular into the 700 megahertz band, so doing there the coexistence studies and determining the final band designs for the ITU Region 1, Europe, Middle East, Africa. So what else can we do but just look for new bands? There are new bands, by the way. New bands meaning taking spectrum away from someone else who uses it, so doing refarming. So on the technology side, there is something already proven now, carrier aggregation, that does not buy new spectrum but uses it more efficiently by bundling together spectrum in various bands. Then certainly we look into dedicated bands, like most prominent maybe the 700 megahertz band. And then as spectrum is a finite resource and occupied also by other services, we have to look into sharing models. So one model certainly is unlicensed, as touched upon by Bob earlier. But we also believe that there is a way to share spectrum with incumbent users in a way called Authorised Shared Access or Licensed Shared Access, where we have the benefits of close to exclusive use, let's say, for an operator, so very well predictable conditions when and where he can use it, leading to quality of service being predictable in those bands, and thus justifying the investment into the networks required to transport the data. So going a bit more into detail, so carrier aggregation, a technology in LTE-Advanced, so extending the LTE capabilities. There is a first commercial application now in Korea with the operators, where basically they can build a 20 megahertz carrier out of 2 10 megahertz carrier in diverse bands. So taking the user experience to a new level by having more spectrum, meaning more bandwidth available to the user, but also allowing with very clever interfrequency resource, radio resource management measures to use the band more efficiently. So really steer the traffic more flexibly and more dynamically across the available frequency resources. This will expand in future into multiples of 20 megahertz carriers, so up to 100 megahertz of spectrum can be addressed. By the way, triggering maybe new regulatory discussions, as something like 100 megahertz certainly exceeds the individual resources of one operator licensed within one band, but may even span more spectrum than an operator has in all his bands typically. So I think this triggers a discussion around spectrum pooling among operators to really make the most out of the technology. So we'll come to that in a second, where that could be beneficial. Now, so-called new bands, meaning looking where could mobile actually still build on. So on the left-hand side, you see a typical European situation, maybe in 2010 or today. So with 900 GSM, the 1800 GSM now being partly refarmed with LTE in many countries, the 2100 UMTS. Then many countries have added in Europe the 800 and the 2600 bands. But where can this continue? So again, probably the next big thing is the 700 megahertz. Not so much for capacity actually, but more for coverage. So the lower the band, the better the coverage conditions. And if we look at these ambitious digital agenda targets, 30 megabits to every household by 2030, we probably need to look into wireless because it's just economically not viable to dig to the last farmhouse with fiber. But then to carry something like 30 megabits over a couple of kilometers wirelessly, we need a decent amount of spectrum. We probably need more than 10 megs. We probably need even more than 10 in 800 and 10 in 700. We rather need something like 60, maybe below 1 gigahertz. So combining 700 and 800 resources, so pooling them together, allowing for sharing and pooling models, and really then throwing all that spectrum at these types of radio link, where there is actually not a huge capacity demand. Those will be isolated spots. But there is a significant saving potential in that. So the German Ministry of Economics has tasked the study to TÜV, and the results are available in some, condensed report on their webpage, unfortunately just in German, but bringing down the cost from a projected over 80 billion euros for fiber to every premise in Germany. Then a mix of all fixed technologies would bring down those costs to the range of 34 billion euros, so less than half. If you add wireless, meaning LTE-Advanced, carrier aggregation, spectrum pooling below 1 gigahertz, that goes down to something like 19 billion, so roughly a 15 billion saving from wireless addition to that technology mix, and actually to a very small percentage of households, so those that are 5 kilometers away from the next fiber endpoint. Which would mean still with, let's say, something like VDSL vectoring, digging 4.5 kilometers, and then just using the old copper line for the last 500 meters. So this explains these big savings. The big cost is not associated with equipment, unfortunately. As a network equipment manufacturer, the costs are associated with civil work, so digging to put the fiber in the ground. So 700 being that very prominent topic, but then certainly we're looking into 3.5, so partly allocated to WiMAX in certain countries, but not used too intensively. So those will be great capacity layers once 2.6, for instance, gets filled. Another important band would then be 2.3 gigahertz in Europe, where we have quite some incumbent use, and incumbent use that will not go away quickly. That cannot just be refarmed in a traditional manner. But then if you look closer to that incumbent use, it's often limited in geography, limited in time. So there is plenty of room to share, and there's given one example here, so that many large cities in France actually could use that spectrum, given that there is the right regime in place that on the one hand certainly gives full guarantee to the incumbent service, and keeping control, keeping their control over the spectrum, but then sharing where it is possible. And this is authorized shared access that we have been developing as a concept, so very much together with Qualcomm and Nokia. We have demonstrated that in the last Mobile World Congress in a joint demo, and recently also in a trial in Finland. So something bringing a harmonized band, so we've touched upon harmonization earlier for the economies of scale, for the global ecosystems, we need these harmonized bands. So there is a 2.3 gigahertz commercial band in 3GPP being deployed in other regions of the world. We have that spectrum partly available in Europe, so we can bring these existing ecosystems together and make the most use out of it. So authorized shared access sits somewhere in the middle between this mainstream approach for mobile operators that had been traditional clearing of spectrum, auctioning of spectrum, and then very clear exclusive use for mobile broadband, and the unlicensed approach in the very much in the Wi-Fi space. So it sits in the middle, giving those necessary properties like predictable use of the spectrum for predictable quality of service and the required security for the investment into a shared environment. So it's now looked into and very much concluded in FM53. So the draft report is available there. There's FM52 looking at the particular application into the 2.3 gigahertz. So we're quite optimistic that with this concept, we provide a very viable tool, additional tool into that toolbox to actually solve those challenges on the spectrum crunch side. So again, stressing the harmonization, and that would conclude my view from a network, mobile network equipment manufacturer side. Thanks very much.
Yeah, no, that's great. Herman Schepers from GSMA will follow up, and then we'll do questions together. And I do want to make one point that there's this issue of sharing, which is one of the big trends that we're seeing globally. And there are various ways of doing that. And the authorized shared access with the sort of the sharing of the license bands is really new and very forward-looking. Again, it's about the efficiency so that we can get the use. And maybe later we also can talk about, and there's some people here in the room I know who are also looking at dynamic spectrum access uses for other types of use. And again, which that lends itself very nicely to some of the more intermittent uses, such as some of the machine-to-machine. So sharing clearly is one of the trends globally with how do we get more from this fixed resource. So that was great that you brought that up. Thank you. Herman.
Thanks.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Pleasure to be here today. My name is Herman Schepers. I work for the GSM Association. I hope most of you will know by now what the GSM Association is. If you don't, I would recommend you come to Barcelona, to the Mobile World Congress, which is taking place every year in February. It's becoming incredibly big. I decided to buy myself some jogging shoes to be able to walk swiftly from one side of the conference center to the other side, which these days takes about 30 minutes. Last year we had about 73,000 participants. Anyway, that is the Mobile World Congress. I work as part of the Government and Regulatory Affairs team within the GSMA, and I'm responsible for Spectrum, the Spectrum program. One of the biggest programs. We've got about 20-25 people now, globally, based in different regions, working with governments and regulators on the prompt release of spectrum that has been identified for mobile. Not always an easy task. There are a lot of competing interests in spectrum, as you can imagine, broadcasters, aviation, defense, and so on. But I think we're getting there. When we asked the operators or the CEOs of our members what the GSMA should focus on more and where the GSMA should lead and coordinate, often the answer is spectrum. So hence, a fairly sizable increase in that investment in that program. Just very briefly, the GSMA by numbers, we are probably the biggest trade association in the world at the moment. I think we're close to 500 employees and growing. We have a big new department within the GSMA, which is the Mobile for Development team, looking at bringing M services, M health, M education to developing countries, working with big funders like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But we also have decided to move away a bit from the center of our focus, which has been Europe. For legacy reasons, we've been focused strongly on Europe, with our headquarters in London, and that is fine, but the growth, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, is in emerging markets in many developing countries. So we've started to open offices in Delhi, in Brazil, growing our office in Hong Kong. We've recently opened in Nairobi as well. So in that way we can actually provide governments and regulators with good benchmark information on various issues such as licensing and spectrum pricing. We're at 6.6 billion mobile connections now. Bob probably has better numbers than I do, so I apologize if not entirely up to speed with the VNI. The VNI is fantastic, I think. That includes not only GSM technology, but also other technologies. And 3.2 billion individual subscribers. That's quite interesting, I find. When we are in India, it was a massive market, we are close to 900 million connections, not subscribers. The average subscriber in India has 2.2 SIM. So there's a lot of scope for growth. Perhaps very briefly, these are the key programs of the GSMA. I won't actually talk through these now. Bob, for example, already addressed mobile connectivity, or connected living, we call it. It's about a world where everything intelligently connects. We're looking at probably 20 billion connected devices by about 2020 or 2025. And looking at services such as mHealth and smart metering. But that is where the GSMA comes in. The GSMA brings together all these various players in the ecosystem. Not only mobile operators are members, but also associate members, internet companies, media, entertainment companies, vendors, and so on. We bring them together to look at new go-to-market solutions and services. This is a model we often show to government and regulators when we speak with them, because of course at the center, at the core, at the bottom of this model, there are network operators. The network operators employ people, pay taxes, invest in infrastructure, invest in licenses. But that's not where it stops. We work with device manufacturers who are in a continuous race to develop more intuitive, smarter, faster handsets and drive a lot of innovation. But that actually then moves to all the various sectors of the economy. And that is, I think, a key point to make, is that we increase productivity by providing access to emails, application, and internet at any time. And this is a massive impact on GDP. You might have heard of the UN study, which basically shows that a 10% increase in mobile broadband connections increases GDP on average by 1.38%. Now, just very briefly on the rise of mobile broadband, I think we're at 1.6 billion mobile broadband connections globally, a huge success story, and a lot of room for growth. If I look at Asia, we've got 788 million, and by the way, I think these are July or August 2013 numbers, and they go up, of course, daily. But only 18% penetration, so a lot of room for growth. Just giving Asia as an example, the biggest growth market, region, sorry. I think the point of this slide is basically to show that all roads ultimately lead to LTE and long-term evolution. There's been a lot of technologies. We started with simple voice and basic SMS. The story of mobile is about continuous investment in new technologies. But 2G has a large role to play. I think let's not forget that at the moment 70% of all connections globally is 2G. And that is here to stay for quite some time. The regional impact, I think, getting a bit more into spectrum, the spectrum discussion, there's a tremendous amount of value in spectrum, and unlocking that spectrum and allocating it to mobile on the whole has incredible benefits for a country's economy and society. Just to highlight one of the studies we did, if you would release as soon as possible the digital dividend spectrum in Asia, across Asia, the 700 megahertz band, below 1 gigahertz, gold dust for the mobile operators, great opportunity to roll out networks in a cost-efficient way, would be worth nearly $1 trillion, ladies and gentlemen, in additional GDP, a staggering amount. So we talk a lot to governments and regulators about these things. Now, it's of course not just about releasing the spectrum. I think first and foremost, one of the key conditions for the operators is a stable and transparent regulatory framework. Where the operators, where mobile can thrive, but where the operators are confident to invest longer term. If things like retrospective usage charges are being imposed on the mobile sector, for example, this has happened in India recently, that doesn't help. When licenses get cancelled, again, India, but doesn't help. Relicensing, crucial for operators to have clarity about what is going to happen with the license. And for these rules not to be clear and made clear, perhaps a few months before licenses are up for renewal, doesn't help. So of course spectrum is key, but at the end of the day, we need a very transparent and clear regulatory framework. Bob already spoke about spectrum harmonization. Spectrum harmonization and scale. Of course, this is a key issue. I think for vendors to get out of bed, they will probably need to know that they can at least develop or at least produce 100 million devices. These are big numbers, and this is where harmonization helps. So harmonization gives scale. Scale brings down prices. Bringing down prices creates more demand. So you get into a positive, virtuous circle of benefits, if you like. And of course, it enables people to roam, and it reduces interference. Again, these numbers are outdated. I think over and over again, we're very surprised with how the mobile data traffic is increasing. I know Cisco stands out on this graph, but that is because they include Wi-Fi traffic. I think on this graph, Orange, Analysys Mason, and Ericsson come together in 2015, I think predicting about 28,000 petabytes. But staggering, really. In 1999, the ITU predicted that by 2015, data traffic would overtake voice. In actual fact, this happened in 2010, just to give you an idea. The WRC process, this is very, very crucial to us. Only once every 4 years, as a mobile industry, we have an opportunity to get more spectrum allocated to mobile. This is not only the focus of the work I do. Approximately by region, there is 1 gigahertz of spectrum available to the mobile industry. If we look at the increase in data traffic, and if we take into account efficiencies and densification, we have calculated through various demand studies that we need an additional 1,600 to 1,800 megahertz of spectrum. So that's enormous. Now, this WRC process, the World Radio Communications Conference in Geneva, is a great opportunity. In 2012, we agreed on an agenda item for mobile. Now in 2015, we're going to discuss in which bands more spectrum will be made available to mobile. But of course, there's broadcasters, there's aviation, there's defense. There's a lot of competition here. So it's going to be an interesting debate. Now, on the whole, it takes about 10 years. So, ladies and gentlemen, about a decade ago, we agreed to allocate the 800 megahertz band to mobile in Europe. The auctions are only happening now. And technology moves on. So it's a fairly slow process too. Sorry, just one back. Like I said, there's about 1 gigahertz available right now. We have agreed with our members on the candidate bands that we would like to to be made available for mobile in addition. These are the C-band, 3.4 gigahertz to 4.2 gigahertz, often used for satellite communications. The extended 2.6, it is from 2.7 to 2.9 gigahertz. The L-band, 1.3 to 1.7, and below 790, the domain of the broadcasters. So yeah, I think on that note, I'd like to finish and welcome any questions and debate. Okay, thank you.